The birches wore their winter bones and no leaves, only a blush of green at the tips where the sap had started its quiet climb. Frost turned the earth crisp underfoot, and every breath came out as a white ribbon that drifted away to be taken by the wind. The dawn had come thin and brittle, a pale seam between black branches and cloud. Ghost padded ahead of John with a slow confidence, the direwolf's paws skimming the hard ground, white fur silvered by frost, red eyes alive and searching. They had walked all night. Tormund complained because he always complained, and because it kept him warm. "You've a sour mood this morning," he muttered into his beard, chewing a strip of smoked walrus and making faces when the fat clung to his mustache. "Is it the cold? You used to love the cold. Or is it the thinking? The thinking crouches in your skull like a skinny woman and won't let you sleep." "Stop talking about skinny women," John said without turning. The sound of his own voice felt strange to him in the waking forest. Too many months of quiet had taught him to give his words only to those who needed them. "You'll scare the birds." "What birds?" Tormund waved one thick arm and his bearskin cloak let go a little cloud of hoarfrost. "Birds with sense are south where the fat sheep live and the kneelers sing them lullabies. Only crows live past the wall, and them as have no sense but stubbornness." A raven, as if summoned by the insult, flapped from a black, leafless limb above them and cut a ragged line against the sky. Ghost snapped at the air, tail twitching. John stopped and looked north. There was a smell he knew and a smell he did not. Snow and cold, smoke and wet fur, the faint brine that meant a wind from the shivering sea. Under that, something fresh, the smell of stones warming, a little of bark dampening. He had been beyond the wall long enough to know that such smells could be deceits. The forest liked to promise. They came to the clearing that had once been a campsite made by the living to watch the dead. The ruined ring of stones was still there, blackened by fire. The snow melted to dirty slush around it. There were old tracks and new. Free folk had been using the place, and recently, an old spear had been set upright and decorated with loops of sinew and fishbone, as if the spear watched the clearing and liked what it saw. Hanging from it was a sprig of pine to say the hunters had found game. On the ground lay a small piece of stitched leather with 3 teeth keeping it shut. Tormund made a face and kicked it aside. "Charm," he said. "Luck for a birth, or so the women say. Might be the babe's luck never got into the leather to begin with." John crouched and warmed his hands over the old fire stones as if the heat were still there. He could feel Ghost watching him. The direwolf's breath was steady and calm, but every other sound, the scuff of Tormund's boots, the whisper of the wind through dead grass, the distant ice groan of a river, threatened to unravel the morning. He was thinking of letters, thinking of promises that were too short in their words and too long in their consequences. It was the thinking that kept him awake, as Tormund said, and it had a sharper bite than the cold ever had. "You'll have to speak, Snow," Tormund said. He made the last word a tease, but not a cruel one. "You hate it, but you'll have to. It's this day after the other days. They're waiting to see your face and hear the sound your teeth make when you bite a word in half." "They know my face," John said, rising, "and they know I don't like crowns. And yet your head keeps finding them," Tormund said cheerfully, "like a rock keeps finding my toes in the dark." "Not a crown," John said. "A way," Tormund snorted. "A way is the kind of thing men say when they want to be the thing they say they are not. A way is a road, is it not? And roads start at someone's door and end at someone else's gate. Ah, but you won't be king." He slapped his belly, which was swaddled in hides and scars. "Then who will they follow when the first big argument breaks? Will they follow Tormund Giantsbane, who likes listening as much as he likes quiet shitting? They'll follow the man who killed the dead and who keeps a wolf as pale as old bones. I can teach them about drink and women and how to lie in a snowdrift without dying. The rest is yours." John did not answer him. He remembered another clearing, fires licking high under the shelter of a cave mouth, the hot ache of a wound he thought could be salved by the press of someone else's skin. He remembered her hair red as the leaves of the heart trees and a laugh that made the world feel like a dare. Ghost nudged his hand. John rested his palm on the direwolf's head until the memories folded themselves away. "Come," he said. "The sun's thinking of showing its face." By midday they found the first of the free folk waiting for them. A clutch of hornfoot hunters had whitened their ankles and feet in ash until they gleamed like stones in starlight. Their leader was a woman with hair as pale as driftwood and a cunning scar across her upper lip, as if she had bitten a blade in two once and liked it. She carried a barbed spear and did not bother to hide her displeasure at seeing them. "We stalked a snow elk all morning," she said without greeting. Then your big friend laughed at his own joke, and the elk decided he had no more interest in being meat. "That was a good joke," Northmen said. "You laughed. I saw it in your nose." She did not smile. "Our boys have sent word to the Thens and the cave dwellers," she said to John. "They'll be at the place when the sun breaks tomorrow. Some say you'll make us kneel. Some say you'll hand us back to the cold." "I'm the one who opened the gate," John said simply. It was not a boast. It was a fact that tasted of ash. "I won't shut it on you. You opened it for the dead," she said, enjoying the strike. "Your dragonlass did that. Or was it her beast? All the stories are different, and all the stories smell of smoke." He had known this was coming. Had known it since he'd left the south with Ghost padding at his heel and Nortmen's laughter chasing the old shame away. The Dragon Queen's ashes were the only grave she'd have, and the wind had them. The fire had eaten the wheel, and the wheel had not learned the lesson of being eaten. John had no room in him left for oaths. He had just the shape of them. "I'm not here to make anyone kneel," he said, "because that was the only place to begin. I'm here because the old ways and the old walls don't answer the new questions. I'm here because you live here and will live here, and because the things we were afraid of are done with. The world did not end when the dead did. It kept walking, and so must we." "H&H," she said, and squinted at him as if he were a track that had crossed itself in the night. "I'm Hama Crowstooth," she said at last. "I'll listen." Black Cloak. They set out together. The place was Craster's old hall, though the hall itself had been burned twice over and put back together by those who hated its bones even as they used them. John could smell the past there the way a wolf smells the laugh of a fox carried on a still night. Whoever had done the rebuilding had known what they were doing. The timbers were stout and well-spaced. A longhouse now rather than a den of a petty tyrant, and the only bed with pride was the hearth. 100 faces were there by the time the sun lit the door. 100 more waited behind them, careful and not careless, because free folk did not like to show the true count of their strength unless they were of one mind, and free folk were never of one mind. Spears were set outside the door with their barbs turned outward. Custom said you did not bring a spear into a hearth unless you meant the people inside to become meat. Knives, though, were knotted at wrists or hid in boot-top shadows, and axes leaned against legs like faithful dogs. They made room for him like ice makes room for weight, grudgingly and with calculation. Northmen, who had been born to feasting and muddy fights and the loud pleasure of people, stood to his full height and bellowed like a bull walrus until the talking died down. His cheeks were red with delight and drink and the cold. He held up one huge hand. "Hold your tongues, you fart sacks," he said. "Hold them with both hands if you must, or tie them in knots and play with them later by the privy. You know me, you know the wolf, you know the man. He's here to speak, and you're here to listen, and then you can make noise again." "HRR," the crowd said, some smiling, many not. John stepped forward. Ghost went to lie by the hearth, where the heat would warm his belly. John wanted to crouch beside the wolf and put his hands into the fur and lose himself in the animal calm that the world could not bruise. Instead, he took a breath and let it out. "You remember Mance," he said. "You remember him because he stole you from each other and gave you back to yourselves. Some of you hated him for it. Some of you loved him. He wanted to take you south. He wanted you to live where the ground yields more to the hand than a bone finds flesh, where the snow makes a thin blanket and the wolves are small. He failed because he mistook his want for your want. He failed because he met men who would rather hold a thing and kill it than open their hands and share it. He failed because the dead came and winter grew teeth. He could feel the listening in the room shift. It was not agreement yet, but it was no longer readiness for a fight. He kept his voice narrow and steady. "I do not want what Mance wanted," he said. "I am not the South. I am not your old way either. You know what winter was. You know what it can be again. But the threat we killed together has changed the land. See it in the sap rising early, in the thaw at the foot of the frost banks, in the fish running heavy in the eastern water. The wall is a scar. We do not need to live as if we are the wound that made it." Words? A man growled from the edges, and the room bristled as if a blade had been unsheathed. John followed the voice. An Ice River man with cheeks tattooed in black crescents, hair matted with salt and grease, broad wrists knotted with old rope scars. Words without meat. "We do not kneel, Wolfman. Tell us how not to kneel." John felt the old anger rise and let it pass through him the way wind passes through bare branches. "You will choose," he said. "You will make a thing that is yours, and you will keep it safe from those who are not you. To do that, you will need more than a promise shouted before a raid. You will need to hold to your word when your belly aches. You will need to put down old grudges when they threaten what you build. Free folk are free because no man puts a chain on their wrists. Free folk are free because you fix your own chains to your own rules. Let us make rules that cannot be bought with a cask of salt pork." "What rules?" Hama Crowstooth asked. She had come up near him, quiet for one so fierce. "The kind the kneelers love? Taxes and tallies and pisspots counted and named." "Neither kneeler rule nor free-for-all," Tormund said before John could answer. "Listen with your whole ear, not just the part that likes shouting." He grinned and showed broken teeth. "We've been walking and thinking. Hard work, but like fucking in the snow. Once you get started, you want to finish. We hold a moot every year at the thaw. We bring meat and argument. We choose a speaker, call him what you like, king if you need to scratch that itch. First among liars, the big mouth. And we give him 7 things he can do without coming back to the fire to ask. He can raise men to guard the ways. He can settle blood price without us killing half our strength with vengeance. He can tell those who prey on us to take their boats and piss back into the sea. He can open the old plaques that are too bitter for one clan to hold. Then the frostfens where the hot water runs hard home, and say who can use them so we stop killing each other for a warm stone. He can speak to the South in our name when they want to look past their belly fat and see us. He can break those who break the rest. He can lay down his voice when we choose another and not come back with a knife in his sleeve. There are more than 7 things in the world, the Ice River man said, but his voice was less eager for a fight now. The room had turned its face toward Tormund, and toward John by reflection, like a field of withered stalks leaning after a wind. "We'll make more things," Tormund said. "You'll gnaw them and spit out the bones and we'll make them again. We won't kneel. We'll stand in a ring and disagree until our throats are sore. And sometimes it'll be his voice that decides the argument when the night is shorter than our words." It took the better part of a day to argue it. The longhouse filled and emptied, filled again. Men who had meant to go back to their snares stayed because the heat of debate can warm a man as well as a fire. Women who had meant to stay listened with their heads cocked like hawks. John spoke when he must and listened when he could. He forgot to eat and remembered when Ghost bumped his thigh with a cold nose and a stern red look that said even a leader should chew. By dusk, with the light leaking around the edges of the door like honey spilled down a board, they were set to choose a place and a first purpose. "Hard home," Hama said at once, as if she had been carrying that word like a coal and had finally found a hearth for it. A murmur went through the room, dark and fearful and ill. "Hard home," she said again, louder. "The curse there is in our heads. The dead took it from us. The dead are gone, and we let their shadows sit where we would sit. The bay is good water. The cliffs are good stone. The seabirds are fat and the whales know the current. Hard home eats boats," someone said. "The fog eats men. Then we will give them something too tough to eat," Hama said, amused. "And we will teach men to read fog the way we read tracks." She turned to John. "If you want a thing that says this is new, we must make the most haunted place into a home." John looked at the faces. He saw fear and the hard resolve that follows fear when it meets a wall in the mind and jumps anyway. "We send fire," he said. We send wood and stone. We send botrytes, and we ask for those who've sailed far past the point where the sea glows, and we build. We build a hall that the wind will learn to love. We build a dock with teeth for ice. We build a beacon that will make the fog run away. The Ice River man grunted. And if the South wants to eat it, they can see us then where we are. They will trade, John said, or they will fight. I have made my share of fights. We won't win a war we don't need. Give them a place to trade with fewer knives. Eastwatch. The watch is thin, the wall is thin, but the gate's there and the place knows ships. Eastwatch can be half yours and half theirs, where fair weight is weighed, and the men in black can stand between and serve something that is not dead or south. You ask the kneelers to share? Hama said skeptically. Kneelers do not like sharing. They like owning. They can learn, John said. He allowed himself a small smile. Sansa can teach them. She learned how to take back what was stolen from her, and she learned without loving the thief. She keeps the North. She loves it more than she loves the sound of her own name. The thought of his sister sent a sudden ache through him, deep and raw, as if he'd taken a cold knife between the ribs. He swallowed. The boy king south of her sits the throne and sees far without moving. They'll both want something. We'll make certain the something they want is what we can give without choking. And if they send a lord in a furred cloak with men who smell of butter to say we are their subjects? It was a thin young man, one of the Thens, hair shaved to show the old marks of his valley. He held his spear like a prayer. Then we remind them what it means to walk past the wall without being asked, Tormund said with relish. We've spears. We've teeth. We've a wolf that eats buttered men. The laugh that went through the room was real, and it loosened the tightness behind Jon's tongue. They chose. They did not name a king that first night. They named a work. They named a place. They named the danger. Not the South, not the dead, but themselves. They named the first suppers and the first shelters. They named 40 men and women who knew wood and stone and weather. Jon was one of those, and Tormund looked smug as a bear with a stolen fish because he'd already expected it. After the hall spit them out into a night that carried stars like cold seeds, Jon stood by the old gate where Craster had once stood and thought himself a god. The gate was only a gap in a wall of rough logs now, and the ground where girls had cried was clean with frost. He thought of the way the wind moves through a forest's high canopy, of small movements adding up until a thing the size of a mountain sways and does not break. Behind him voices rose and fell, the low fierce music of plans. Ghost leaned on his leg. Tormund put a big hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed. See, he said simply. You hate it and you're good at it. I'm not a king, Jon said. No, Tormund agreed. You're worse. You're a beginning. Hardhome was in his dreams long before it loomed out of the wet white. Fog sat on the world like wool soaked through, folded and refold until it had grown too heavy to lift. The outcrop that had once been like a sideways finger pointing into the shivering sea rose ahead of them. Black rock veined with pale ice. It had been a hungry place, and it still was. The bones of old piers chewed by winter's jaw jutted, and the cries of seabirds carried and made the fog seem thinner without changing it. They came in a string of boats hastily made from long, straight pines felled with more hopes than axes. The men and women who pulled the oars did it with a grim rhythm that did not ask for a song. Smells like ghosts, one of the botrytes said, in the simple way of men who know wood. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and shrugged. Well then, ghosts can learn to hold a hammer. The old town had burned and burned again. He saw where fire had licked the cliff and left a tongue of soot. He saw where a cave mouth had been widened by heat enough to make stone sag. The dead had given up the place, but they had not wiped themselves from memory. Jon felt his heart slow and then settle. He set Ghost ashore first, letting the direwolf test the ground. He would not command men to step where his animal feared. Ghost sniffed, took in everything, and did not bristle. Jon jumped down, his boots hitting the sleek black stone. He knelt and put his palm to it. The rock held its cold like a story it liked telling again and again. But underneath there was a little give, a little dampness that meant water had been there and would come back. He rose quickly and shouted for rope. They built a fire that night that ate like a starving thing. They piled driftwood and pine and old timbers split down and fed the flames until the fog retreated and fought to find its footing. When the fire was a tall, bright beast with many tongues, John stepped back and felt sweat trickle down his back under his furs. Tormund stood grinning on the other side, face as bright as a midsummer child's. The gathered free folk watched and made sounds that were not fear, or were fear trying on another face. Hama came and took John's arm. She pointed with her chin, the way free folk do when they show something they hope you're smart enough to see for yourself. He saw then the runways the seabirds used to hurl themselves into the wind and return. He saw where the cliff face could be cut to make steps. He saw where the old piers could be guided into new piers like old bones set straight and given new flesh. He saw where the fog would always live and where it could be denied. He saw the possible shape of all that was not dead. At dawn, a north wind came off the sea and showed them the shape of two whales rising and falling in lazy arcs like a woman breathing in sleep. The men who knew how to handle bone harpoons told him they could build a fishery here to feed 100 mouths through a winter of storms. The women who knew the way of smoke told him they could make the flesh keep if there was enough wood and patience. Then men traced the stone and shook their heads and then nodded and then shook again, counting how many hands would be needed to cut enough blocks to make a haul and how many toes would be lost when the stone froze and split. John listened and said, "Yes, yes, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll make the world say a word it doesn't want to say, and the word will be ours." He sent word south. A boy with long legs and good eyes and a raven learned under Sam's patient hand took a message to Castle Black. He wrote to the Lord Commander, who was not much of a lord and barely a commander, but who wore the black and tried to make the black mean something in a world that had forgotten the color had once mattered. He wrote to Sansa, who would read his letters with her mouth a tight line and her eyes soft. He wrote to the boy King Bran, who had once been a brother with wet cheeks looking up at him from a tower window, and who now sat inside the wooden eyes of half the forest and never needed letters to see what letters tried to say. John knew the last letter was a courtesy more than a need, but courtesy had once been what kept men from chopping each other into usable pieces just because they'd had a bad night. He asked a thing that would have made Mance laugh and spit. He asked that the North open Eastwatch as a market where free folk could trade furs and bone, fish and iron and the odd pretty thing for seeds and plows that did not break the first time they met a rock, for pots that did not crack at the first good heat, for salt and lime and words that would teach his bowtrites how to build ribs that bent and did not scream. He asked that the Night's Watch stand between the scales. He asked that northern men who came to Eastwatch leave the old loathing behind when they walked through the ice gate, and he promised that free folk would leave the old hunger for raiding outside the same gate and show their teeth only when teeth were needed. When the ravens went, he felt the quiet after an arrow leaves a bow. Hama stood beside him and arched a pale brow. "You ask a lot from people who like to think they owe the world nothing," she said, not unkindly. "I ask what I think I can get," he said. "I ask so I won't have to take. And if they say no, then we find a way to need them less," John said. He watched Ghost stalk the edge of the newly claimed shore as if the direwolf had always known it would be his. "And we look north again. There are hot valleys where then men make gardens in summer. There are rivers that do not freeze for long because a fire lives under their beds. We are not as poor as they like to imagine when they sit by their hearths and tell their children stories." She gave him a look behind which moved a respect she would not name. "You speak simple," she said. "It makes clever men think you are simple too. It makes the rest of us trust your voice." He slept in a narrow alcove carved out of the black rock that had warmed under the fire's obstinacy. In the night he felt Ghost's hot weight against his legs and dreamed of the wall near Castle Black. One section along the east where the meltwater always ran a day ahead of the rest when the spring thought of coming. In the dream the ice seemed thinner, the blue deeper, as if the old spells woven through it had faded like dyes do in a rug that has been moved into a room with too much sun. He woke sweating under fur and stone, and for a moment everything in him that could be frightened woke with him. The dead were gone, he told himself, the way one tells a child that a door is only a door. The dead are gone, and their going has cost us the weight of what had held them. Fear is just a thing that likes to sit where weight used to sit. Work is the truest magic in any world. He learned that from his father as much as from any maester. He set himself to work, and it saved him from counting how many sorrows could fit into a day. He supervised the cutting of the stones. He learned the way fog moves and the way birds read it, their bodies' small truths against a big lie. He learned from thence that the best mortar in this country used blood, and he argued them out of that with patience and a steady hand, because he would not have that old rule return to eat their new one. He ate smoked whale until his stomach lost its memory of lamb and beets and the warm fat of a duck and stopped complaining. He learned names. He deliberately learned the name of a boy with fox-like eyes and fingers that tried the weight of any knife left near him and decided he did not need watching if he had tasks. Good, necessary tasks that made him tired enough to sleep. When the first northern ship came skimming the edge of the fog with a cautious grace and a high prow that wore the head of a bear, the children ran along the shore and shouted until their voices were hoarse. The men who came off the ship wore wool and good boots and the kind of faces that moved between curiosity and disgust depending on who was watching. Their leader was a Mormont. Alisanne, not the bear queen of old, but a cousin with a jaw like a rock and a laugh like a bark when she was pleased and a single black braid that lay against her back like a rope she trusted. She looked at the new piers, sniffed the smokehouse, and nodded once. "It will hold," she said, "if the fog lets it." "The fog helps keep raiders away," Hama said, and Alisanne grunted as if that argument were more to her taste than talk of trading and markets. They spoke, heads bent, Hama showing her where nets would go and where the wind would catch the smoke and ruin dried meat if a man set the fire wrong. The northern captain spoke of the market at Eastwatch he was building on. Men setting up booths with spiced beer and salt pork and cloth that did not itch. He spoke of a black brother who had cried at the sight of free folk coins that were just bone carved with a mark and bright again when scraped clean. "Primary thing to know," Alisanne said aside to John as they stood and looked out at that cold shining expanse eastward, "is that Sansa will not suffer fools and will not be one. You've asked for even scales and a straight carpenter to measure them. She will send one." "I have asked for what can be held in the hand," John said. "People die over ideas they cannot lift." She cut him a sidelong look that was more sisterly than courtly. "I liked the small wolf better than the big one," she said. "The one who swung his sword and confessed his fear later. But this wolf is the one we need to make this not a war." He would have answered her, but Ghost, who had been lying on a flat stone with his nose on his paws, rose so fast it was a shiver turned into a leap. He ran down the pier and stopped as if the sea had lips and had whispered something ugly. John went after him. He saw then a ship sliding low in the water like a seal that had learned to carry axes. The ram was tipped with bone. The men on it wore hides dyed the color of rock. Their faces were white with ash. Their oars lifted and sank with a rhythm that made a human mockery of breathing. Skago's men. He knew them by the way their eyes took everything and put nothing back. "Back?" he said quiet, and the word moved down the pier into the town like a mouse into grass. Men began to take down nets with the same motion they used to pick up spears. Women who had been gutting fish wiped their hands, and their knives went from tool to promise. Hama walked into the open where the pier widened and did not look left or right. Ghost's lips rolled back and his teeth showed as if the white of them would speak better than any word. The Skagosi ship, others were behind it but slow, keeping their low dark shapes cleverly under the fog's lip, bumped the pier with a sound like a big animal hitting a smaller one and being pleased with the noise. A man stood tall in the bow. He had a beard like a waterfall and bones braided into his hair. He lifted a horn that had a curve so sweet even the men who hated him felt themselves wanted a little. He lowered it without blowing. "We smell new meat," he said across the sliver of water. He spoke the old tongue fondly, as if it were an old dog he liked to feed with secrets. "We smell the smoke of a proof that men think themselves gods. We smell a market where meat walks up and puts its throat on the block. Skago's has enough meat of its own," Hama said without moving. "You take from your own slow herds. That meat is tough," he said, "and we like frost with our fat. But sometimes a man wants to bite something that screams in a new way. That is what trade is, yes. A new scream. You'll find we trade in harder things than screams, John said, stepping forward. He kept his voice mild. We trade in work. It sticks in the teeth and is not worth the trouble to some. Black brother, the Skagosi said, tasting the word the way a dog tastes a bone to see if there's any marrow left. We heard a black brother had rallied the flea bites and fleas and made himself a coat out of their itch. We did not believe. And yet, he smiled, and the smile was not a thing a man could trust, but it was a shape of truth. We could burn you out and take the bones that would be left. We've done it before. We did it when the dead came. Tukwa. Tea could be taken then too. The dead were slow. You are quicker. You could try, John said, and you would leave a lot in the water. What you have left of women who are not your cousins would weep over you and then forget you, because that is what tears do when winter turns its face. Or you could bring sacks of salt and take casks of oil. You could bring iron with good temper and take baleen and tallow. You could take the skins the whales leave us and do with them the clever work you do. We could both leave with our throats unsliced. The man laughed. You offer bone for metal, fat for fire. We are not so poor in our own huts. He tipped his head. He was younger than his hair. You will sit between south and north and ask your black brothers to weigh heavy for you. We will take this place when the fog makes you blind. You mistake us, Hama said, and the irritation in her voice was sweet as syrup to John. The black brothers will stand between us and the red-haired bitch down south when she forgets to look past her wall of pride. We need them then. We do not require their help to keep your boats from scratching their bellies on our rocks. We can do that with stones and oil and fire. He admired how calm she was. He admired how her hand had not moved toward her spear, though he knew every muscle in her arm yearned for it. The Skagosi looked at her, and for a heartbeat he saw something like respect. Then the man spit into the sea and shrugged. We've had a long row, he said. We'll share a drink and see if the fog tells us a better story. Your knives can sit on the high shelf and our axes can sit on ours. Let us show each other our bad manners and decide whether they are funny. He grinned. Your big friend looks like a man who enjoys drink. Tormund was smiling as if he'd been offered 2 feasts and a bed with a bearskin that purred. John put a hand on his arm. 1 cask, he said quiet. Not 2. 1, Tormund said loudly. For all of us. And a bowl of stew. Skago's stew is so thin you can read a map through it. That night the Skagosi sat in a ring and ate the stew and did not complain. They looked at the new beams being raised over the hall that would face the sea with the stubbornness of a man who had set his mind not to move. They did not test knives. They tested words. John tested them back. When at last the Skagosi rose to go, some of their men drunk, their captain not. He thought the sweat on his back was more than the heat of the hall. He took Hama aside. They'll come with more boats, she said, enjoying his look. Of course they will. They've found new meat. We'll be ready with oil and stones and the tricks my grandfather taught me because he was a man who loved tricks more than he loved any wife. We'll be ready, and if they break our new piers, we build them again. That's the only way to win a fight like this. We make it too costly for them to feel clever. He nodded. And we send to them. And we send men to the frost fens where the ground sweats and our women can plant seed and see what happens. Hunger makes fools. I want fewer fools. It was then that the first answer from the south came. The raven landed splay-footed on the sill of the hall window that had begun to take its shape, and the boy with the fox-eye eyes took it with the calm of someone who knows that a bird can hold fate if it has been trained to do so. John read Sansa's words by the light of a lamp made from a cut baleen rib and a wick that smoked a little because whale fat is vain and likes attention. Brother, she wrote, not your grace, not crow, not anything else but the word that was a little house big enough to hold the distance between them and a great howling love that had been made into something neat by grief. The North keeps faith with the living where the living keep faith with justice. If the watch will judge at Eastwatch, then Eastwatch may be a place where a man lays down a load and picks up a fair bargain. Markets are good where men can be seen clearly and counted. If you mean us no harm, then bring 10 men you trust to meet 10 men I trust at the gate at the end of the road from Queen's Crown. Bring Tormund. I would like to see whether his beard eats soup or whether soup eats his beard. There was more, written in small neat script, the kind that you trusted not to spill a secret even by accident. She wrote of the seeds she could send that would survive a cold ground and a short sun. She wrote of the men who would sell good plows and not lie about their iron. She wrote of a measure of salt set aside for those whose catch would salt a dozen winters if they had only the grain of it. She wrote that Brienne would be among the 10, and John smiled unexpectedly and felt his heart lift and twist at the same time, because he hoped Brienne had found a little joy in a world that did not seem made for her shape. "Tell him we are not his friends," Bran had told her, John imagined. "Tell him we are not his enemies. Tell him he is the space between." He felt Bran's eyes like a wind through a grove of heart trees, not looking at him, looking through him, beyond him, to the shape of what he tried to make. He did not fear it. He did not love it. It was a comfort and a sorrow that such seeing could not be switched off. They met at Eastwatch when the fog was a soft cloth and the wind had a breath that did not gnash. The wall there still wore its old height like a crown that had slipped. A great bite had been taken where the dragon had frothed and burned. Even now, the scars in the ice had not forgotten the heat. Men in black moved along the top with the uneasy grace of those who have forgotten what their steps used to mean and are trying to learn again. Sansa came with the men she trusted. She wore no crown and no fur so heavy it would have swallowed her small stiff pride. She wore a blue cloak that made her hair brighter. Brienne stood beside her, face as serious as a vow, and just behind was a man with hair too. Fine to be a northerner and hands that could not leave off touching quills and measuring things in the air. He had the look of a maester, though his chain was short. "Sam," John said, and Sam Tarly's face crumpled with happiness so open it hurt to see. "John," Sam said, and had the grace to swallow the other name with it, the name that belonged to books and to songs and to things that had been made small by being sung too loudly too soon. "You are thinner. You are fatter," John said, and then he was hugging Sansa and she was cold and warm at once. Cold from the wind and warm from the fact that her bones were alive. They went to the gate. Sansa ran her hand over the old black wood. "This place always made me think of throats," she said, and raised one brow when he blinked. "A gate is a throat in a wall. Food goes through a throat and words go through a throat. Sometimes knives go through too. It can be a place to drink," John said, "not only to swallow or to spit. They made a market. It took all day, and half the men in black lost patience twice and then found it and pretended they'd never dropped it. They measured a strip that would be nobody's and everybody's, the width of 5 carts, the length of a man's impatience, which is to say longer than he thinks when he starts and shorter when he finishes. They pounded in posts that had been marked in advance and poured stone around them, even though some men said that was foolish when the ground might shift. Sansa countered that a man who trusts nothing builds nothing, and Brienne argued men who trust everything die, and John took a breath and set a weight on one end of the scale and then on the other and made it balance. They asked the watch to keep numbers and to keep a place where a woman could swear by what she'd counted and feel the thing she had said settle around her like a cloak. They asked the watch to keep their fingers out of the sacks and their noses out of the jugs except to smell for rot. The Lord Commander, a small gray man who smiled with difficulty, agreed as if the agreeing wrung something out of him he hadn't known was there. They spoke of Skagos then. Sansa had news that did not surprise him, but it was the sharpness of the blade, not the fact of having been cut, that made him draw in breath. The Skagosi had been raiding the coast east of Carhold and the Bay of Seals, harrying, testing, building boats whose bones were better than old bones had been. They had men who had learned a bit of shipwriting from the wrong sort of night, and they had the hunger of a land that fed its children badly. "They'll not honor your market," Sansa said. She had parchment in her hand, but the paper could not help her with this truth. "They will honor only the cost of breaking it. Then we show them a cost they don't want to pay," John said, and Brienne's mouth made a small shape like the beginning of a smile. He turned to Sam. "I need oil, and lime, and iron nails as long as my hand. I need a man who can read a tide like a book and tell me where to put stones and where to leave the water alone." "I can find all that," Sam said. "I know." He stopped himself from saying, "I know men. I know letters that will make those things move." Later, as the sun broke itself thin against the edge of the world, and the cold came with silent feet to stand under their tongues. Jon walked along the top of the gate and Sansa matched his pace. They said nothing for a time. The wall's shadow cut the land in two. The wind spoke over and through it with a spite that could be mistaken for tenderness if a man cried into it. "Are you happy?" she asked him suddenly, and he nearly laughed, but laughter would have broken in his mouth. Happiness was a word like summer. Everyone says it when the berries are sweet and forgets the long months between the harvest and the first green, when the mouth tastes of old grass and salt. If he had ever known it, it had been brief and had not announced itself. Felt safer not to look for it. "I feel right," he said. "Some days. Others I don't. A lot is loud. A lot is quiet. I think that's true for the living." She took that in and let it settle. "The North will not call you an enemy," she said at last. "I will not let it. There are men who will try to grind us together to make their bread. I will not let them either." "I am a beginning," Jon said before he could stop himself, and her head turned so quickly he thought of wolves again. "Yes," she said, and he could not tell whether she was pleased or afraid. Skagos did not delay. 2 nights after the first formal trading at Eastwatch, 2 days after a woman from the Hornfoot clan exchanged a basket of whitely gleaming tools carved from narwhal for a spool of linen thread so fine it was like hair, the first Skagosi boat slid into the water off Hardhome in the dark. The oil on the surface caught fire. It moved slower than a man who is careful with a knife. Men on the boat began to shout, and then the flames ran, flickering little beasts under the lips of the planks, up into the ribs, and the ship became a candle set afloat on a black plate. On the cliff above, Hama Crow's Tooth spat once and said, "Rocks next time," as if she were choosing a different spice for a stew. They learned each other with a quickness born of hate and necessity. The Skagosi learned which peers bit back and which took the bites and swallowed them as their cost of doing business. The free folk learned when the fog would carry the smell of death and when it would keep it close. Men died, sometimes the wrong ones. Women too. Children watched and understood more than was safe for their hearts. There was a night when Jon stood knee-deep in water so cold his bones thought of cracking. A line around his waist. His hands on a man's shoulders as they tried to ease his leg out from where a beam had caught him. Ghost stood on the pier above him and made a low sound that was not a bark. The man under the beam a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin like a careless river. He had 6 children and the patience to tie knots with fingers that were too big for the delicate work. He would not scream. Jon saw his face and knew the moment his heart would break if they left him. He did not leave him. He called, and the line went tight, and the beam moved, and the man came free with his leg in a shape that legs do not choose if they can help it. Hama set the bone so quickly you might have thought she had done it 100 times, which she had. The man refused to cry again, as if 2 groans in a night were a luxury. They splinted him with planks cut to measure and wrapped the leg like a child and told him it would hold if he did not walk on it. He walked on it days later when the call went up that Skagos had come again, and then stopped walking when he fell on his face and wept with a terrible anger that had no object. The thens came at last in number, moving like dark ants over the white face of the world. Wide snowshoes spreading their weight neatly, sledges dragging stone and rope and wood. Their Magnar, who was not the same man Jon had known and killed and regretted, because the world does not leave anyone standing long enough to remain who they were, spoke with him and with Hama and with the men who knew tides. He spoke with the head of the Night's Watch at Eastwatch too, and somehow made it a courtesy rather than a test, which meant he either had more patience than most men or less pride. He taught Jon the old trick of greenstone mixed into mortar to make it cure harder in salt air. Jon taught him the trick of listening to a woman whose eyes saw the track under the snow and the track in the wind and not pretending you had seen it yourself. By the time the first summer came in truth and never more than glanced north, the hall at Hardhome had its roof. It had windows that cut the fog in pockets and held it like trapped breath. It had a floor polished by feet that came and went, and beams turned by careful hands until they fit like stubborn brothers who had decided to live together. The market at Eastwatch had begun to acquire a smell that was not just piss and ambition. It had dried herbs that women and men who loved cooking called by names in old tongues. It had bundles of oats and barley that bowed under their own weight and made free folk women hum without knowing they did. It had coins now, free folk coin on one side carved in whalebone, northern coin on the other, flipping like little moons in a new sky. It had an argument every day between two men who disagreed about what a fair count was for a sack of nails, and a kiss every day between two people who had met for the first time under that gate and did not know yet what it would become. And still there were men and women who wanted the old shape of things. They wanted a king they could hate or a king they could love badly. They wanted a fight that would make them feel clean afterward for a few hours. Men from the Ice River clan who had never liked Hama Crowstooth to begin with because her mother had insulted their grandfather's cooking when both had still been children, and insults leave marks longer than knives. These men gathered under a bluff where the wind went to rest and argued that this new way made them weak. Among them a man named Ragwile, with a voice like an iron grater and eyes that watered when he laughed, claimed he had found the horn of Joramun under a cairn that had shifted when the frost went in deeper than it had since his great-grandfather's father was a boy. "Blow it," men said, hungry already for the breaking of something. Ragwile lifted the horn. A thing of old black bone with rings of iron set into it, and blew. The sound it made was not the sound of the world ending or of the wall weeping. It was deep and it was low, and it crawled into men's bellies and made them think of being children and hearing their fathers come home angry. It was not doom. It was dread. That was enough for some. He took a dozen of his men and walked to Eastwatch with the horn on his back like a sin. He stood in the market where fishmongers shouted and merchants weighed objects with exaggerated solemnity to impress those watching, and he blew the horn again. Men flinched as if a blade had run under their ribs. Birds rose in a ragged line. The Lord Commander came to the edge of the Scales house and held his ground by force of will where his boots wanted to step backward. John heard of it at Hardhome, where he was helping a woman with a lazy eye and clever fingers affix the last run of shingles to the seaward slope of the hall's roof. He came as quickly as a horse and a path and a day allowed. When he entered the market, the smell of oil and fish and heated iron seemed to lean in to watch. Ragwile lifted the horn as if it had pulled his arm up. He smiled, and his eyes watered the way they did when he laughed. "If you let us make your markets and your halls," Ragwile said, the words bouncing off the ice like stones thrown into a well. "You force us to kneel little by little until we do not notice the pain. If you blow this horn, the old ways return. The wall falls," he said. "Let the old lie say itself," and men who knew better did not call it a lie, because a lie that gives you back your pride is a thing that some cannot refuse even when it steals their other goods. John took a step until he was so close to Ragwile he could see the tiny pale lines at the corner of the man's eyes where cold wind had drawn its small map. "If that horn could bring the wall down," John said quietly, "you could not lift it. The world would crush you under it rather than let its own bones break so easily." Men laughed at that, a little. Ragwile's smile grew fixed. "You have learned to talk like a kneeler," he said. "You make a small thing sound wise and men clap for you." "Or I have learned to say true things without a song around them," John said. "If you break T.'s market, you will make a winter for your own people. You would rather be strong with fewer hands and more graves? Learn to be strong with more mouths and fewer men who think themselves kings because they are too proud to share." "Do not tell me about kings," Ragwile said, and the horn quivered under his hand. "You are the only one here who does not need a crown to be a king. If it had come to a fight there, men would have died badly." They announced as much with their shoulders and the particular silence that falls on a gathering when enough steel is ready to come out. The Lord Commander cleared his throat, and everybody ignored him. Ghost came to stand at John's leg, red eyes on Ragwile's throat as if the skin there offended him. It might have gone any number of ways, but it went the way of luck. Sam Tarley tripped over a coil of rope and fell into the edge of a stall where a woman had been selling lumps of hardened pitch. The pitch rolled, fell onto the ice, caught a bit of grit and slid toward Ragwile's feet with a speed no one expected. Ragwile stepped back to avoid it, and his heel hit the low edge of an ox cart that had been craftily piled so it would balance on its axle just so. The cart tipped as if to complain, dumped a stack of planks, and one thumped the horn out of Ragwile's hands to land like a dumb thing at the foot of the scales as if it had come to be weighed and found wanting. Silence came, then laughter, It was cruel at first and then softened when men remembered they themselves had fallen and been laughed at. Ragwile stood, face mottled, looking around for the horn as if it had betrayed him. The Lord Commander bent, lifted it with a grunt, and laid it on the scales. He added weights until the plates matched. He wrote down the number. He looked up. "Will you take a price for it?" he asked, and by breaking the moment into small bits he saved lives, which is what the old Black Order had been built to do and forgotten. Ragwile stared, then snorted. "You can give me all your weights," he said, with a nastiness that had turned inward because outward had failed him. "I will take your weights and your priest's numbers." He did not blow the horn again that day. He took it away, and some men followed him out of the market. Some of those later came back. They came back with eyes that were calculating less and seeing more. The horn appeared in stories before it appeared again in a square. Men whispered that if you held it and breathed into it in the right place, you could hear a sigh like a woman at the end of a long birth, and if you did it a few more times, you could hear the sea move in a way it did not on its own, and if you did it beyond that, the drowned would speak your name. John did not forbid it. He forbade only that men use it to frighten children, and he made that a heavy fine, a day of work in a place whose work you did not like. He did not know then that he would hear it in a very different way much later, when the year had turned and turned again and the thaw came too quick after a long stillness. He did not know that the horn would call something he had not expected, and that he would have to look a different truth in the face and love it the way you love a scar that will not be covered. He did not know then what the work of kingship would be when there was no king and what the price of beginnings always is. He knew only that he was tired and that he would have to sit an hour with his back to the new hall's rear wall and shut his eyes while the smell of smoke and whale fat and stone dust told him he was where he should be. He had never learned to stop dreaming. On the nights when he woke with a shiver and sat up too quickly and ghost made a sound like a yawn sharpened into a blade, he would go outside and stand on the cliff where the fog writes its soft black alphabet and scours it away. He would stand there and feel the ground under his feet and the two kinds of cold, one in the nose that likes to play and one in the bones that likes to measure, and think of a boy running a blade with a sharper boy beside him who would one day sit a throne and not move except in the minds of trees. Hama Crowstooth became the bone inside Hardhome's hand. She was there for every fight that began and many that didn't because she saw them and put a hand to them before the first blow could turn into the second. She had a story about everything and did not tell them in order to make men love her. She told them as tools. The Thens learned to like her without admitting it. She learned to like the Magner by degrees she pretended not to own. Tormund was a bright sun that warmed days that would have been dull. He broke 3 barrels with his laughter and never apologized. He adopted a boy of 9 whose mother had been taken by the sea, and the boy adopted him back, teaching Tormund to hold his spoon another way because his old way spilled too much. The boy told Tormund the dead had long ears, and Tormund told the boy the dead had bad taste. They kept each other honest in that way. Sam came and went, a small boat making short safe trips between bigger waters. He loved to stand on the new hall's balcony and watch the fog breathe. He wrote things down. He taught 3 girls to read because they asked him and would not go away when he tried to sleep. He taught a boy whose father thought letters were a sickness and then changed his mind when the boy read him a letter from his sister that said she had not died in the cold after all and had married a man whose hands had the right number of fingers and who did not bite. That letter had been written in a clumsy hand that had learned to be patient with itself. The father changed lots of things after that, and most of his changes lasted. When the second winter began, less savage than the last because the dead were not there to make it grind its teeth, it brought with it something old. The longshore ice came early and stayed late. Crack began along the cliff north of Hardhome, a long dark mouth that widened like a grin. Men who had been garrisoning an outpost there came back talking in low voices about noises inside the ice that were not the groan of river or the sigh of slow movement. They took to making the sign against listening that their grandmothers had taught them. John sent men, Hama and a half-dozen who knew how to listen without being eaten by what they heard. He went himself a day later when they did not return. It was not heroism. It was the knowledge that a man who refuses to go when he must does not get to ask others to go again. He walked with Ghost ahead of him and with the Magner and 2 then boys with quick feet. They found the outpost empty, but for the things that people leave to say they intend to come back soon. An iron pot coated with soot, a comb made from bone with hair still threaded in a tooth, a set of dice that were not carved but made from tied sticks and leather because dice had been a sin in an old house and the sin had stuck. The crack had become a mouth. It did not go straight, which would have been a kind of mercy. It bent and slid and sank, the kind of path men build only when they cannot build a better one. They lowered themselves down with rope and patience and spoke softly, not because they thought they would wake a sleeping thing, but because the world had changed shape and men knew how to behave in a place where the world had changed shape. Quietly, with respect, with an eye to where you would put your foot next. In the depth, where the ice turned black and the light turned blue, they found the thing that sang. It was not a thing with a mouth. It was a place. A river ran under the ice, ran there and had run before men from the south ever built their great wall and told themselves they were gods because their wall held. The river had been dammed during the longest winter. The dam was made of cold and fear and a little of whatever magic men's stories make when enough of them tell the same lie for long enough. Ragwell's horn had found the seam and worried at it with a sound men's bellies did not like. The thaw had turned the seam into a crack. The second winter had been the hammer. There were bodies. Hama lay there looking shocked at the unfairness of falling and breaking her head in the dark because the dark had not been warned they were coming. Her hair was spread around her like the ghost of wings. One of the then boys had died trying to climb out with her tied to him by a rope around their waists, and the rope had been smarter than they had been. The other boy had found a place where a bit of frost fern had fretted its elaborate pattern and then broken and placed his hand there, and the ice had not held. Under them, the river's mouth had begun to open. They brought Hama back because to leave her would have been a kind of degradation no story could forgive. John lifted her himself and felt his back complain and told it to be quiet. The Magner took one of the boys and would not look at John because he had a thing to do and looking would have broken the strength of his arms. They left stones where they could not lift the men who had fallen into the open mouth. They used words to others they could not bring home. That night, in the new hall, with the lamps burning whale oil and the wind making a sound around the eaves as if it had never learned to speak a language men liked, John stood and waited for the grief to come and drink him like a cask. Came in a measured way. It came like cold water poured slowly over a man's head. Not suddenly like a barrel broken open. He let it. In the morning he spoke to the people. "We tell ourselves the dead were the only hunger we had to fear," he said. "The truth is that the world itself eats. It eats with dark and cold and water. We can make ways to eat back. We can put stones where ice will break them. We can cut channels where water cannot rise. We can learn to hear strain in the ice the way we learn to listen for fight in a word. We can choose not to send our best into a crack without a line tied to their waist and a second line on the first. We cannot stop being eaten. We can make it expensive." They did. They moved stones. They cut channels. They learned the river's song and taught it to boys who had never found a tune with their mouths. Some of them died because men always do in such work. Most of them lived long enough to teach what they had learned to someone else. The grief did not lift. It laid itself over the place and made a new shape that people learned to walk with. Hama died in the winter. In the spring they chose another to be the bone inside the hand, and a woman called Arwael, short and tough and with a smile that only came when she had cut a knot in a rope and saved someone time, took that place. Arwael did not have Hama's taste for stories. She had a taste for getting things done. The hall stood. The market stood. Eastwatch acquired a man who could be trusted with weights, and he became as important as any banner had been when banners saved nothing. The Skagosi learned to bite and let go when the bite tore out a piece of their own jaw. They learned to trade, a little, and to complain about the weight of the ale with the same joy with which they once had complained about the weight of captured men thrown on their ships. In the third year, a small thing happened that was not small. Hama's old mother, who had lost 3 children to what free folk call the luck of living, came to the hall. Her hair was white and her hands shook. She asked John for a favor. "What do you want?" he asked, and she spat to the side in the polite way of her people, making the request clean of too much pleading. "I want a tree," she said. "A heart tree." "There are no heart trees here," he said. She lifted her chin and looked at him with the contempt old age earns. "Then fetch one." It was not a thing a man could fetch the way he fetched rope or oil, but he had learned the art of doing the thing that the world says cannot be done by finding not the thing itself but its shape. He sent men south to the parts of the gift where old groves still grew. He asked to buy a sapling from a stand that belonged to no man but to the watch and to the old rules that sometimes still put their tongue to the air to see what kind of weather it would be. A man said they could not cut the young of a sacred thing. A woman said they could dig around a sapling with its winter sleep upon it and carry root and soil together and ask it to live. They did that. They carried it north, wrapped in cloth and wet moss, swaddled like the baby of a family that had longed for a child and bought it baskets before it was born. They planted it not far from the hall, its thin trunk paling under the fat bright sky. The women who knew about seeds and the men who loved watches most of all came to stand around it and try not to fuss. Sam came, of course. He bumbled and nearly put his foot through the soft new earth until a boy pulled him back and said not that way, and Sam put his hands up as if a knife had been held at his throat, and the people laughed at him and the laughter made it right. The sapling took. It took slowly the way a winter gives itself to spring. Grudgingly and then all at once in a single day that you never expect to be more than 2 degrees warmer than yesterday. One morning it had new leaf. Another, too. A week later it wore a dozen little hands and shadows made a softer shape around its feet. Hama's mother died the following winter with a smile like a fissure in stone, and they cut her back open in the old way and planted her under the tree with a prayer that was as simple as a meal. The tree drank that spring and put on a little more life to say it had something to celebrate. When they had asked their first speaker, they did it because the work had become too much for the hour around the fire to answer. They had argued for 3 days. Men had stormed out to find a piss and come back as if the world had a changed color. Women had brought babies and fed them at the back and glared at men who began to shout before the babies fell asleep. Raguile had not come. No one had asked him. He had stood outside the circle of light and made comments that were meant to be clever and had been a little too bitter to be so. They called the roll with the simple dignity of people who do not have the habit of formalities and feel silly attempting them. They spoke each name in turn and then moved to the next when the first did not have enough voices behind it. When they spoke John's, the sound it made was like a gull crying and a sword coming out of a scabbard at the same time. There were many yes and many no's. He stood and waited. He would have refused if the no's had been many more than the yes. He would have refused too if the yes had been so many that the choice felt like a fever. But the margin had in it the kind of health that a loaf of bread has when it is well baked, neither raw in the middle nor burnt at the edges. He accepted because refusing then would have been pride. He wore no crown. He made no oath that he could not keep. He put his hand on the weirwood sapling and felt the skin of the bark cool against his palm. He said he would judge when judgment was needed and would ask others to judge with him when the work went beyond a single man's thought. He said he would gather men to stand at the edges of ways, roads so new they were only lines men traced with their feet, and would ask those men not to make themselves lords while they kept those ways safe. He said he would step down when the thaw came the second time, so that the speakership would not be one man's shape, and he would not argue if another was chosen and did not ask him. He said the beginning does not own the ending. He said a beautiful, simple thing: if work is a kind of prayer, then judge me by the things we build. That winter the Skagosi came one more time, with 3 boats and a taste for testing. They came at night and found the oil again. They came from the shallows and found the stones Arwael had placed within hands and ghost dog patience. They left 2 boats broken and 1 limping and did not come again in that number. Some of them came later with bags of iron and a way of shrugging that said what had been was never going to be again. And that shrug was a piece better than any paper men might have signed. Raguile blew his horn once more, down between 2 ridges where men had once sworn an oath they had already broken. The sound went into the earth rather than up into the sky. It reached the old river under the ice, and it made a low humming in the bones of those who could hear it. The ice at the cliff's lip shifted a little on a day when boys were playing a game with carved bones, and a painted rock stood for a king or for a mother depending on who you asked. No one died. Raguile watched the boys, and his face went slack like a man's who has forgotten a dream he was sure he would remember. He came to John one evening and put the horn down with a thump. He did not look at the wolf. He did not look at the hall. He looked at the weirwood sapling, large enough now that a boy could stand in its shadow and vanish for a moment. "It was my father's," he said. "It was not the horn." His eyes were wet in the way they always were when he laughed. "Make it useful," he added roughly, as if he feared what he was doing and thought an insult would make the fear less. John took it and thought of all the ways a thing can be used that are not the ways men first think. Arwael hung it high in the hall's main beam where light could find it and make it less a threat than a memory. Men who had feared it learned to nod to it the way men nod to old dogs who no longer bite and like to doze in doorways and sneeze. The letters came from the south rarely. It is not that what they had built was unimportant. It is that the South had its own work, and men write more in times of ease. Sam wrote more than the rest, and he wrote the way a man might carve his children's names into a beam that has held up a house through a storm. He told them of a book being written that would make nobles snort for a generation, and then turn gentle when they read it to their children in beds with sheets and a hearth that did not soot their lungs. He wrote that a maester he was learning to ignore had told him that the world north of their stone wall and the sea's hard teeth did not matter, and Sam had smiled as if the man had said meat did not matter compared to spices. He wrote that the little woman with dark hair who had taught him to look under words for their hidden teeth had asked after John, and sent a small carved thing, a fish filled with fish, a joke in wood that had caught an old smiled memory between the ribs. Sansa came once more. She stood in the hall and wore her northern black with a strip of wolf fur around her shoulders, and her hair looked like the fire had found it and loved it. She looked around and made the face of a woman who would have bought it if it had been offered and then changed it because she did not need it but loved it. They stood by the weirwood that had begun to stretch its arms more greedily into the sky, and they did not speak immediately because there had been too many words in their lives and both of them knew the value of saving them. "You look like father when he thought he might change a thing by the weight of his thought," she said at last. "I wish I looked like him," John said. "It might make me less tired." She smiled and it reached her eyes slowly. "He would have liked this," she said. "He would have said you were being foolish. Then he would have helped you be foolish in the cleverest way possible." "I cannot tell whether I would have loved to hear him say that or whether I would have hated it," John said, and she touched his arm as if it were an old habit. Perhaps it still was. At the thaw when he stepped down, as he had promised, he felt the strange lightness that follows a long carried weight. He wanted to run for 3 days and sleep for 4. He did neither. He stood at Arwael's shoulder as men argued for a new speaker and did not speak unless asked. He watched as a retired raider with a bent wrist and a good mind for loads insisted they choose a woman who had kept the storehouse dry for 2 winters that would have soaked most men's in a fortnight. They did. Her name was Torna. She had a laugh like a bark and a way of counting that made men ashamed to lie. John listened to her speak her promises and felt younger without being younger. Ghost grew old with him, but the old in a direwolf is not like the old in a man. The wolf's muzzle silvered in a way only a man who looked close would see, and his eyes did not dim. He walked more slowly, but he did not go less far. Sometimes, in the mornings when fog lifted and the birds dared their small brave flights again, John would watch Ghost go to the headland and sit as if watching for a ship. He was watching, John supposed, for the world. It had been trying to get their attention a long time. In the end, there was no crown and no king and no ending. There was work done well and work done badly and much more of the first because men had learned to love it. There were seasons that looked mean at first and then yielded their tenderness, and there were seasons that promised sweetness and fed them sourness instead. There were men who forgot the rules and discovered the price of doing so was a fine they would grumble about while paying it and paying it again. There were women who held the kinds of numbers in their heads that make other men either dizzy or envious. There were children who grew up with the smell of whale fat in their noses and the habit of speaking to a direwolf as if he might answer with words one day and who were a little surprised when he didn't. There were Skagosi who learned to trade without calling it trading and to laugh at men they would once have killed because killing them would have made the laughter stop. There was a hall that faced the sea and learned to like the fog. There was a market under a gate that had once been a throat and had learned to be a mouth that did not bite. There was a weirwood that put on leaves every year a little faster until one day a man looked up and thought, "When did you become a tree?" There was a man who said, "I am not a king, and then learned how hard it is to tell the truth and not have men make a crown out of it anyway. He lived. He judged. He stepped down. He stayed. He listened. He slept when he could and woke when he had to, and spent whole afternoons watching a woman named Torna teach a boy to count chords by touch, so he could tell if a man had tried to cheat him with rotten rope. He laughed sometimes when no one expected him to. He stood with Ghost and looked at the place where the sea turned black and then gold and then black again, and let the wind say what it always says, which is only that it is there and that you are too, and that both of you will learn each other in time. The wall did not fall. It melted by inches that would have been inches even if men had not measured them. It drank light with less hunger after the old spells lost their fat. But it stood like a ridge of memory that did not know how to lie down. The Night's Watch wore their black and learned to talk in the market. They learned to keep books of weights without weighing their hands on the scales. Some grew fat. It is the fate of men whose work becomes easier than the work that came before. When their ease threatened to become laziness, a woman with a voice like a rasp would stand and clear her throat. She would not need to speak because men remembered the river under the ice and the fact that it does not care whether men are lazy. There were no songs that made it all beautiful. There were songs that children sang aru. A fire when the fog was thick and their grandparents wanted to hear something other than their own breath. There were songs that kept time for oars in the water. There were songs that mothers made up at the ice edge so their babies would not cry while the seals swam behind the blue. There were songs that came out wrong and made people grimace and then grin and then forget. The men who write books wrote a few words. Some of those words lasted letter to letter across years. Most did not. Years later, in a spring that had no ladders in it and no boxes that said do this first then this second, John walked with Tormund to a place where the birches had decided to believe in themselves again. Their thin leaves touched and made sounds like small hands clapping. Ghost wandered ahead, tail low, content, stopping now and then to look back the way old men do when they are pleased that young ones are still following. Tormund chewed something, likely wood, and made a noise of a man whose knees felt the weather before the sky bothered to show it. "You did it," he said suddenly, shaking his head as if it surprised him even as he had known the truth of it all along the way. "You stubborn, quiet bastard. You did it." "I did not do it," John said, but his voice was warm. "You always say that," Tormund said, "and then you go and do it while saying that. You know what you are." He did not wait for an answer because he never needed one. "You're a winter that decided to feed us instead of kill us. That's what you are. You've no crown. But they'll make a story of you yet and say you weighed the fog in your hand and taught it to be friendly. When they do, tell them not to put too much salt in it," John said. "Men don't need to drink brine." "I'll tell them," Tormund said. "I'll tell them how you sulk and how your wolf farts. I'll tell them you snore. That will make it just," John said. They walked on. They came to the weirwood. It was big enough now to make a man feel small. It wore its red leaves in a way that made the light change when the wind shifted. Its face had been carved by careful hands. Not a fierce face, not a sorrowing face. Patient face. A face that could find work in any day and not be bored by it. John stood and put his hand on the bark and felt the old cool, the young strength. He did not pray because prayer had become for him the doing of things with as much care as he could find in his bones, and then letting the things be what they were. He stood with a man who had once laughed his way through grief like a man running a hand through a pelt, and with a wolf who had seen more endings than any of them and still liked the way fish tasted when they were fresh. The sea breathed. The fog stepped aside for a moment and then came back because that is its way. Men were fishing. A woman shouted at a boy and the boy laughed and did the thing anyway and was pulled back by his collar and made to do it differently. A Skagosi boat slid, full and heavy, and the men on it raised a hand in that rude, practical salute that had come to mean more than any banner. Eastwatch's market would open in an hour and the man with the crooked nose who judged weights would scratch his ear, then scratch his head, and then scratch his ear again as he considered a day's fairness. "All right," Tormund said to the world, and the world answered by existing and not waiting for them, and that was enough. Ghost, who had grown old and not grown soft, looked up at John as if expecting to be told whether this was a day for running or a day for lying in the sun. "Both," John said aloud. because there are days a man can have both and only fools do not take them. He walked down to the shore and let the cold water take his ankles and thought, as he always did when the sea touched him, of all the things that could be learned from a thing with no shape that still keeps its promise. He thought of the boys and girls who would grow up knowing how to set a pier under fog and how to weigh iron with honesty and how to listen for a crack in ice with a calm heart. He thought of a woman he had loved and of a king who did not move and a queen who had managed to keep a country and of a brother who had swallowed books because he had no use for swords. He thought of the wolf who had never left him because wolves do not make vows and thus never break them. "Come," he said to Ghost, and the wolf came, and the day, which had begun as so many days, had cold breath, bare trees, the smell of a promise, unfolded without ceremony, which is the only way anything that matters ever does. He walked and felt under his feet the ground of a country that did not need a king to be held together, because it had been taught to hold itself by men and women who loved it in a way that had nothing to do with songs. He thought of the word he had never wanted and had managed to dodge and had somehow found he had become anyway. He accepted it without wearing it, for if a crown is only a circle of work, then let it be a ring left on a table where anyone with hands could take it up. The sea breathed again, and he breathed with it, and in the ring of fog and stone and stubborn will, the new kingdom beyond the wall went on existing, which is the most kingly act anything can do.